Hi, I'm James Leiman, fellow at the Vidine Center for Rural Economic Development at the University of Minnesota. Today, we have a special guest, Dr. John Reilly of MIT. Dr. Reilly served as co-chair of the joint program from 2010 through 2020. As an energy, environmental, and agricultural economist, he's focused on understanding the contribution of human activities to global climate change and the effects of environmental change on both economy and society. A key element of his work is the integration of models of the global economy representing human activity with models of the ocean, atmosphere, and terrestrial vegetation. The main goal of this integrated approach with respect to Dr. Reilly's research is to enable the design of policies that can effectively limit the contribution of human activity to environmental change, to facilitate adaptation to unavoidable change, and to understand the consequences of the deployment of large-scale energy systems that will be needed to meet growing energy needs here in the United States and subsequently the world. Centered on this integrated assessment of climate change research focus area, Dr. Reilly's work is published in more than 150 articles, reports, and volume chapters. Dr. Reilly, welcome to the Agricultural Marketing and University of Minnesota Vidine Center program.
Thank you for having me. I'm looking forward to this.
Yeah, I really appreciate it. You have an amazing background, and you come from your research. I've had an opportunity to peruse some of it, and it's highly applicable. So I'm hoping that the people that listen to this today not only focus on what we're talking about, but also pursue some of the published research that you have, as it's highly interesting and it impacts so many different areas. And that integrated approach is something that I think from a systems level is highly needed. So thank you again for joining us.
Sure, no problem.
Awesome. So, Dr. Reilly, the first question I have for you, climate extremes, and you've done plenty of research on climate extremes and how it poses a risk to maybe stranding energy assets. Given sort of the energy intensification usage of agricultural inputs, what do you see as a result of changing climate and the potential for these risks, or the potential for these stranded assets? What might the impact on agriculture be?
Well, I guess when we were looking at stranded energy assets, we're really looking at essentially resources that won't be produced because we're not using much of the energy anymore. And so if you're an investor in coal, oil, or gas, that the value of your investment may fall. And so we're looking at that as the kind of lost financial value of those assets. So actually, if we do if we do transition rapidly away from fossil fuel prices will fall. That's part of what's causing those losses. And to the extent that agriculture uses some of that fossil fuels, it may actually make the fuels cheaper. Although, of course, we'll want to be transitioning away from those fossil fuels. So that's kind of the trade-off in that issue. So it doesn't really have much of a direct effect on agriculture. But if you're a farmer or an investor thinking about where you're putting your money, maybe thinking about it, putting it in renewable energy rather than in the fossil energy may have more payoff for you.
Interesting. Thank you. The demand and supply structure, I seeing that there may be even a reduction, but on the flip side of that, you may see that many of the companies that buy these large or these products may not buy them anymore because within that supply chain vertical, they may not meet the ESG standards or whatever the case is. So that's interesting. Thank you. Second question is, kind of within the same thread, given that we're approaching a world of climate extremes and we're already experiencing it. Do you see any new opportunities within agriculture? You mentioned renewable, but I'm curious if there's a nexus that within the agricultural space you see with your research.
Well, so climate extremes are generally kind of a bad thing for agriculture. If we all of a sudden have a drought, it kind of disrupts agriculture. If we have extreme wind, it can blow down crops. Extreme storms can flood them. So the opportunities there, I guess, are technologies or things that help us cope with those climate extremes. So certainly this is going to, if you're worried about drought, and that's one thing we probably ought to be, and we're seeing more irrigation, for example, moving more into the middle of the country where we used to think that didn't need irrigation, but now with weather being more variable, irrigation pays off. Precision agriculture looks to kind of have some ability to be resistant to these extremes. And then, just improved weather forecasting and long-term forecasting. Some machinery manufacturers are thinking of integrating, forecasts into this precision agriculture, kind of place the right amount of fertilizer given what we think the climate is going to be that year. So if we could get better forecasts, that would improve, what we plant, where we plant it, when we plant it, and when we harvest it.
Thank you. We're seeing a lot of that research actually here in the Red River Valley at some of the larger research institutions, as well as in the Twin Cities. And it's interesting you mentioned the irrigation component in that. I moved here roughly a decade ago from the East Coast, and you're right. When I look at Western Minnesota and even into the Dakotas, I live on the North Dakota side, but areas that traditionally haven't had irrigation are really starting to experience that. And you read more about it maybe in like Nebraska and areas like that, but it's working its way northward and westward. So it's fascinating to see that trajectory just in a decade. So it'll be very interesting to see what kind of pressures that puts on the aquifers, given sort of the precipitation outlooks long term as well as short term in water management.
I want to add, I don't want to be guilty of something that we tend to all be guilty of. And that's we talk, there's been a lot of research talking about the impacts of climate change on crop agriculture, but livestock agriculture will be significantly impacted as well. Excess heat, reduces productivity and rate of growth in cattle, livestock. We can have some of these really severe heat events where livestock is dying from the excessive heat. So methods to cool livestock, either misting or other sorts of more fans and other sorts of things in livestock buildings, is going to be critical as we move forward as well.
Absolutely. Thank you for citing that. Transitioning from there, I mean, with respect to sort of this within this new paradigm of climate extremes, how might the ag sector contribute to mitigating perhaps some of those climate extremes?
Sure, I think one of the biggest source of agricultural greenhouse gases is actually nitrous oxide from nitrogen fertilizer. So one of the biggest challenges we have to get on top of is how to use nitrogen more efficiently, so less of it is turning into nitrous oxide. So there again, precision agriculture can be really important. Fertilizers that, when you fertilizing it in the spring when the plants are growing rather than in the fall, where you lose more of the nitrogen, is important. And then the form of nitrogen used is also critical. So that's one of the important, people sometimes forget about nitrous oxide and think about carbon management. On that side, agriculture by tilling land can cause carbon to be released from the soil, can speed decomposition. So there are ways we can manage the soil to increase carbon in the soil. So that can be actually a negative effect, reducing carbon dioxide in the atmosphere by moving it from the atmosphere through plants and having it remain in the soil longer. So we often think of that. Methane management is of course important as well. Rice is a source of methane. We don't have that much paddy rice in the United States, but cattle manure management and where we have these manure pits and the manure decays under anaerobic conditions, methane is produced and released. So manure could actually be a massive resource. We could turn, one study we did some years ago suggested that if something like 80% of manure in the United States was turned into methane, that'd be enough methane to power 10% of our electricity needs. That could be really crucial. If we move to renewables, we oftentimes need some source of gas generation to back up renewables when the wind isn't blowing and the sun isn't shining. And if this was renewable methane from manure, that would just be awesome, right? So that could be a real good point there. And then, people don't really think of this so much because this is attributed to the energy sector, but of course, farmland and farm buildings are massive spaces where you can integrate solar panels into the thing. One kind of interesting thing is if you put solar panels over a feedlot, it will shield the cattle from some of that hot sun. So there you're getting a two-for that way, right? You're producing some electricity, and you're also kind of providing some of the shading for livestock. And wind turbines can be integrated into the landscape without taking up much space and still produce a lot of energy. So this provides an opportunity for farmers to, have commercial energy. A lot of times we've looked at the farming situation as, well, we're going to have an anaerobic digester on our farm to produce gas for the farm. We're going to have some solar panels to produce power for the farm. But I think we can look much bigger. These could be large commercial operations. You could think of a whole system of manure recovery to produce methane in large methane digesters. So take it off the farmer's responsibility, but it would be solving their manure problem and also producing a gas that could then be used in electric generation. So, I grew up on a farm, and it was a very diverse farm. It was mostly dairy, but it had lots of other livestock and crops. And that's a very complex situation. So we have a lot more specialization in farming. So identifying additional activities that the farmer has to do just makes his life more complex. So I think we have to look at these as larger markets that actually are then that are supplying services to the farm, but utilizing these resources in other ways, or at least think about the business organization of it. So it doesn't create a really complex burden on the farmer, but rather maybe creates another business opportunity for them.
Yeah, living in a region that obviously is heavily dependent on agriculture as well as energy, given the Bakken energy formation to our west here. But within that space, I think if you posed it more in sort of from the perspective of, hey, here's an additional revenue stream, whether it's selling power back into the grid or using localized anaerobic digestion. I mean, these are things that typically are commercialized to scale that you would think in a much broader sense. But the fact that you could improve the bottom line, both from either a revenue stream or a cost mitigation perspective. I've never even thought of the shade creation, like you mentioned. I mean, that's kind of brilliant when you think about it. Yeah. So yeah, instead of placing it on the farm, perhaps place it on the system, and the system generates more or less the requisite sort of either revenue and or cost mitigation measures. So that's really interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, I think there's some complementarities even with other organic waste. The food processing industry produces a lot of organic waste, and that can be aerobically digested as well. And so you could kind of have this broader waste digestion network that was solving a waste problem and also producing a renewable source of energy.
Absolutely. And it makes, the whole supply chain vertical benefits at that point too, which makes your products that much greener, and you can get obviously premiums in certain markets for having that. So, well, Dr. Reilly, I think you transcended into my fourth question already. So I think that about does it. Anything to add today?
No, I think only that, agriculture faces a lot of challenges with climate change. It's the sector that happens most outdoors of any, right? And so that's going to be a change in climate, which we can't predict really well at the local scale. Just what's going to happen with weather is going to be an ongoing challenge. So the better we can get at predicting that, farmers will have a better opportunity to know what to do with the future and how to adapt to what's coming.
Thank you, Dr. Reilly. I really appreciate your time today, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Have a good day.